I'm Marceline, 32, and I spent 8 years saving for my dream cottage with the wraparound porch. When my in-laws came for a 2-week visit, I never imagined they'd stay 6 months rearranging my furniture and treating me like a guest in my own home. As they systematically took over each room, I felt myself disappearing, until I planned a special delivery that changed everything and made them stay forever. If you're watching this right now, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Hit that like button and subscribe to join our storytelling community. Anyone dealing with boundary-crossing in-laws, this story might just give you some ideas. Growing up in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Portland, I always dreamed of having a place that was truly mine. My parents were loving but practical people who rented our entire lives. Why pay a mortgage when you can invest that money elsewhere, my father would say. But I yearned for permanence, for walls I could paint any color I wanted, for a garden where I could watch my own plantings grow year after year. This dream led me to study interior design in college. I fell in love with creating spaces that reflected the personalities and needs of their inhabitants. After graduation, I landed a job at a boutique design firm in Boston, specializing in renovating historic New England homes. Every day, I helped clients transform houses into their dream homes, all while squirreling away a portion of each paycheck into my cottage fund. For 8 years, I lived frugally in a tiny studio apartment with barely enough room for a bed and a drafting table. While my colleagues upgraded to luxury apartments or bought condos in trendy neighborhoods, I maintained my modest lifestyle. No fancy vacations, no designer clothes, no latest gadgets. Every decision was filtered through a single question: will this get me closer to my cottage? By the time I turned 28, I had saved enough for a substantial down payment. I had a specific vision in mind: a small cottage with vintage charm, a wraparound porch, where I could sip coffee and watch the seasons change, and enough garden space to create my own little Eden. My search took me to coastal Maine, where I found affordable properties with the character I craved. That's when fate intervened in the form of a housewarming party. My college roommate Lisa had finally bought her first home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and invited friends from all over New England to celebrate. I almost didn't go. It was a 3-hour drive each way, and I was exhausted from a week of client meetings. But Lisa had been supportive of my cottage dream from the beginning, so I made the trip. The party was in full swing when I arrived. As Lisa was giving me a tour of her new place, I found myself admiring a beautifully crafted wooden side table in the living room. "That's not mine," Lisa said. "My friend Thomas made it. He's around here somewhere. You should ask him about it." Thomas turned out to be a 30-year-old furniture maker with kind eyes and an easy smile. When Lisa introduced us, he was in the middle of explaining to another guest how he had salvaged the wood for the table from a 19th century barn that was being demolished. "It's stunning," so I told him honestly. "The grain pattern is extraordinary." His face lit up at my appreciation, and we spent the next hour discussing the merits of different wood types, the balance between form and function, and our shared love of craftsman-style architecture. By the end of the evening, he had invited me to see his workshop, and I had accepted. Our relationship progressed with the comfortable certainty of 2 puzzle pieces finding their match. Thomas appreciated my eye for design and color, while I admired his ability to bring raw materials to life with his hands. We complemented each other perfectly, or so I thought. After 18 months of dating, Thomas proposed on the wraparound porch of a historic bed and breakfast in Vermont. 6 months later, we were married in a small ceremony attended by our closest friends and family. Thomas's parents, Richard and Eleanor, hosted the reception at their sprawling home in Chicago. It was my first time meeting them, as they had been traveling in Europe during our entire relationship. I was immediately struck by the contrast between our families. While my parents arrived with heartfelt cards and a handmade quilt from my grandmother, the Aldens, swept in with grand gestures and designer gifts, Eleanor, a former socialite with impeccable posture and perfectly coiffed silver hair, greeted me with ear kisses and immediately began critiquing the wedding arrangements. "Darling, you should have let me help with the planning," she said, adjusting the centerpiece on the main table. "I have connections with the most exclusive vendors in Chicago." Richard, a retired banking executive with a booming voice and monogrammed cufflinks, was more direct. "So you're an interior decorator. That's a nice hobby." "Designer, actually," I corrected gently. "I work with architects on historic renovations." "Well, now that you're marrying into the Alden family, you might want to consider a career better suited to your new social standing," he suggested, patting my arm condescendingly. Thomas laughed it off. "Dad, Marceline loves her job, and she's really good at it." Of course, Richard backtracked. "Just thinking of your future son. Despite these undercurrents, the wedding was beautiful, and I was too happy to dwell on my in-laws' opinions. Thomas and I returned to Boston, and our respective careers settling into married life with ease. We rented a small apartment together, continuing to save for our dream home. A year after our wedding, my cottage fund had grown enough to make my dream a reality. With Thomas's blessing and additional contribution, we began house hunting in earnest. After months of searching, we found it. A charming 3-bedroom cottage in a small coastal town in Maine, just 2 hours from Boston. Built in the 1920s, it had original hardwood floors, a stone fireplace, and the wraparound porch I had always wanted. The backyard was modest, but offered enough space for the garden I envisioned. The day we got the keys, I stood on the porch, taking in the salt-tinged air and the distant sound of waves. "It's perfect," I whispered, tears of joy streaming down my face. Thomas squeezed my hand. "It's exactly what you've always wanted." "What we've always wanted," I corrected, leaning into his embrace. The first year in our new home was a dream come true. I took a partially remote position with my firm, driving to Boston only 2 days a week for client meetings. The rest of the time, I worked from home, gradually transforming each room in the cottage. Thomas converted the detached garage into a workshop and took commissions for custom furniture from local clients. I poured my heart into making our cottage a perfect blend of our styles. My love of vintage textiles and botanical prints, Thomas's preference for clean lines and natural materials. The living room featured a comfortable sectional sofa in a muted green, positioned to showcase the stone fireplace. The kitchen, though small, was efficiently designed with open shelving, displaying my collection of blue and white pottery. Upstairs, our bedroom was a sanctuary of calm with a handcrafted bed frame Thomas had made as a surprise for our second anniversary. The third bedroom became my craft and design studio, with a large drafting table positioned under the window to capture the northern light. The smallest bedroom served as a guest room, decorated simply but comfortably with a double bed, a reading chair, and a small writing desk. Thomas seemed genuinely happy with our home and life. He took pride in installing built-ins I designed, constructing garden beds for my plantings, and adding his own touches throughout the cottage. We hosted small dinner parties for friends, spent weekends exploring the coastline, and fell into a rhythm that felt like it could last forever. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to the frequency of Thomas's parents' calls. At first it was a weekly check-in, then twice weekly, then almost daily. Eleanor always had an opinion about our decisions, from the colour I painted the kitchen cabinets to the vegetable varieties I planted in the garden. "Darling, no one uses that shade of blue anymore," she would say. "And why are you growing heirloom tomatoes? The hybrid varieties are much more reliable." Thomas would smile indulgently during these calls, occasionally rolling his eyes at me when his mother became particularly prescriptive. But he never contradicted her, never set boundaries. And I, wanting to be the perfect daughter-in-law, never pushed the issue. That was my first mistake. The call came on a Tuesday evening in early October, just as Thomas and I were finishing dinner on the porch, enjoying the crisp fall air and the changing leaves. "Mom, slow down," Thomas said into his phone, his brow furrowed with concern. "What happened with the contractor?" I watched as his expression shifted from worry to determination. After a few more minutes of conversation, he hung up and turned to me. "That was Mom. They're having major issues with their house in Chicago. Apparently the contractor they hired to renovate the main bathroom caused a leak that damaged several rooms. The repairs are extensive and the house won't be livable for at least 2 weeks." "That's terrible," I said, genuinely sympathetic. "Are they staying in a hotel?" Thomas shook his head. "Dad's blood pressure has been acting up again. The doctor advised against the stress of hotel living." He paused, then continued with what seemed like forced casualness. "I told them they could stay with us until the repairs are done." My stomach dropped. "You invited them to stay here without asking me first." "They're my parents, Marcy," he said, using the nickname I only tolerated from him. "They need a place to stay. It's just for 2 weeks and we have the guest room." I wanted to object further, to point out that our cottage was barely 1,400 square feet, that his parents were used to a 5,000 square foot mansion, that Eleanor had criticised virtually every design choice I'd made in our home. But Thomas looked so certain, so expectant of my understanding, that I swallowed my concerns. "Of course," I said finally. "They're family. We'll make it work." Thomas beamed, leaning over to kiss me. "You're the best. I'll call them back and let them know. They'll probably arrive this weekend." As I cleared the dinner dishes, a sense of foreboding settled over me. 2 weeks with Richard and Eleanor in our small cottage. 2 weeks of Eleanor's subtle criticisms and Richard's booming presence. 2 weeks of being on display as a hostess and daughter-in-law. I spent the next 3 days in a frenzy of preparation. I deep cleaned the guest room, replacing the simple cotton bedding with the highest thread count sheets we owned. I stocked the pantry with the gourmet coffee Richard preferred and the herbal tea Eleanor drank for her digestive health. I rearranged my design projects to create more space in my studio, knowing I'd need a quiet retreat during their stay. Thomas watched my preparations with amusement. "They're not royalty, Marcy. They're just my parents. I want them to be comfortable," I replied, not admitting that I was also trying to preemptively address any criticisms they might have. The Oldens arrived on Saturday afternoon, pulling up in a rented luxury SUV loaded with luggage. Far more luggage than seemed necessary for a 2-week stay. "Darling," Eleanor exclaimed, air-kissing me on both cheeks before I could offer a genuine hug. At 65, she was still strikingly beautiful, with perfectly styled silver hair, impeccable makeup, and the kind of posture that came from years of deportment lessons. "Your little cottage is just as quaint as I remembered." Richard emerged from the car, his imposing frame filling the doorway as he entered. "Thomas, my boy, come help with the bags. Your mother doesn't travel light, as you know." I watched in growing dismay as Thomas and Richard unloaded suitcase after suitcase garment bags and what appeared to be Richard's personal office equipment. "We'll just put these in the guest room for now," Thomas said, struggling under the weight of 2 large suitcases. "The guest room?" Eleanor's perfectly penciled eyebrows rose. "Richard needs a proper workspace, Thomas. He has calls to make, business to conduct." "I'm sure we can set something up in there temporarily," I offered, trying to maintain my composure. "Nonsense," Richard boomed. "I saw you have a home office when we visited last Christmas. I'll use that." "Actually, that's Marceline's design studio," Thomas explained. "She works from home most days." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "She can work at the dining table. It's only for 2 weeks. Before I could respond, Thomas nodded. "That makes sense. Marcy doesn't mind, do you, honey? It's just temporary." Trapped by politeness and Thomas's immediate capitulation, I forced a smile. "Of course. Let me just clear out some of my things." As I hastily gathered my design materials from my carefully organized studio, I tried to quell the rising anxiety in my chest. "It's just 2 weeks," I reminded myself. "We can manage anything for 2 weeks." That first evening set the tone for what was to come. Eleanor insisted on making dinner despite my planned menu and prepped ingredients. "You work so hard, dear," she said effectively, pushing me out of my own kitchen. "Let me take care of this. I know Thomas's favorite meals." I watched as she rearranged my cookware, opened every cabinet to locate items, and subtly critiqued my kitchen organization. "You keep your spices here." How unusual. Most people prefer them near the stove for convenience. Dinner was a showcase of Eleanor's culinary prowess, with Richard complimenting every dish, and Thomas enthusiastically reminiscing about childhood meals. I sat quietly feeling like a guest at my own table in my own home. After dinner, Richard commandeered the living room television, turning on a financial news program at a volume that made conversation impossible. Eleanor produced a notepad and began making a list while surveying the living room. "What are you working on, Mom?" Thomas asked. "Just some thoughts for small improvements," she replied. "Nothing major, just little touches to make this place more functional during our stay." I excused myself to take a long bath, needing space to process the shift that had occurred in just 1 day. As I soaked in the tub, I could hear Eleanor's voice drifting up from below, discussing with Thomas how the furniture might be better arranged to create more flow. "Thanks." That night, lying in bed beside Thomas, I whispered, "Your parents seem to be settling in quickly." "They're adaptable," he murmured sleepily. "Dad's actually being pretty flexible about the workspace situation. Usually he has 2 monitors and a proper desk chair." "How long did you say the repairs would take?" I asked, a new worry forming. "About 2 weeks," Thomas replied. "Maybe a bit longer." The contractor wasn't specific. As I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Oldens' 2-week visit might not unfold as expected. My intuition proved correct. Within days, Richard and Eleanor had established routines that transformed our home. Richard converted my studio into a replica of his Chicago office, installing his own desk chair monitor and even a small printer. My design materials were relegated to a corner of the dining room where I attempted to work while Eleanor conducted lengthy phone conversations with her friends. Eleanor's small improvements began with rearranging the living room furniture, to better utilize the space. When I returned from a client meeting in Boston, I found my carefully curated bookshelves reorganized by color rather than subject. It's much more visually appealing this way, Eleanor explained when I noticed. Design is about aesthetics after all. I bit my tongue, reminding myself it was temporary. But temporary began to feel increasingly permanent as days stretched into weeks with no mention of returning to Chicago. At the 1-month mark, I finally worked up the courage to ask about the house repairs over breakfast. Richard, how are the renovations coming along? Have you received any updates from the contractor? Richard lowered his newspaper, exchanging a quick glance with Eleanor. There have been some complications. Water damage is tricky business. Could be another few weeks. Or longer, Eleanor added. But we're so comfortable here, aren't we, Richard? Marceline has been such a accommodating hostess. Thomas, buttering his toast, nodded agreeably. No rush, Mom and Dad. Stay as long as you need. I stared at my husband, waiting for him to acknowledge that he should have consulted me before extending an open-ended invitation, but he simply continued eating his breakfast, oblivious to my distress. As weeks turned into months, the Oldens' presence became increasingly intrusive. Eleanor no longer asked before making changes to our home. My blue and white pottery disappeared from the open kitchen shelving, replaced by Eleanor's collection of crystal glasses that catch the light so much better, dear. The guest room transformed into a replica of their Chicago bedroom with new bedding curtains and even wall art they had shipped from home. Richard installed a small safe in the closet for his important papers and added a dedicated phone line for his business calls. The kitchen, once my domain, became Eleanor's territory. She rearranged every cabinet according to her preference, discarded kitchen tools she deemed unnecessary, and stocked the pantry with specialty items I had never used. When I went to make my morning coffee one day, I discovered my ceramic pour-over had been replaced with an elaborate espresso machine. Your method was so time-consuming, dear, Eleanor explained. This is much more efficient. Even the refrigerator betrayed me, filled with unfamiliar ingredients and prepared foods that Eleanor insisted were healthier options than my usual groceries. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed to slip back into the role of son rather than husband. He deferred to his father on household decisions, from the thermostat setting to which streaming services we needed. He beamed under his mother's attention, regressing to what I imagined was his childhood dynamic. Eager to please, reluctant to disagree. When I tried to discuss the situation with him, his responses were always variations on the same theme, their family, Marcy. It's just temporary. You're overreacting. Can't you be more flexible? Gradually, I found myself retreating to the only space that remained truly mine, the garden. Even as the main winter approached, I bundled up and spent hours tending to the cold weather crops, planning the spring planting, and simply sitting in the peace of nature. The garden became my sanctuary, the one place where Eleanor's influence hadn't yet reached, until it did. By the 3-month mark, I barely recognized my own home. Every room bore the unmistakable stamp of Eleanor's taste, formal, traditional, and utterly unlike the warm, eclectic space I had created. The cottage felt smaller, crowded, not just with 4 adults instead of 2, but with the weight of unspoken tensions and crossed boundaries. My weight had dropped noticeably, my clothes hanging loose where they once fit perfectly. Sleep became elusive, my nights spent staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar creaks of a house, occupied by people who treated it as their own. Anxiety attacks, something I'd never experienced before, began to ambush me at unexpected moments, while grocery shopping during client calls as I sat in traffic. I found myself spending more time away from home, extending my Boston workdays to avoid returning to the cottage. My colleague Natalie noticed the change one evening as we worked late on a project. "Marcy, what's going on with you?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "You volunteer for every late meeting, you've lost weight, and yesterday I found you crying in the supply closet." I hadn't realized anyone had seen my breakdown. The embarrassment broke something in me, and the whole story came pouring out. The invasion of my home, Thomas's betrayal of our partnership, my growing sense of invisibility. "Why don't you just tell them to leave?" Natalie asked when I finished. "It's not that simple," I tried to explain. "They're Thomas's parents, and every time I bring it up with him, he makes me feel like I'm being unreasonable, like there's something wrong with me for wanting my home back." "That's gaslighting," Natalie said firmly. "He's prioritizing his parents' comfort over your mental health. That's not okay, Marcy." Her words stayed with me as I drove home that night, a small ember of righteous anger kindling where there had only been helpless frustration before. I arrived home to find the lights blazing and unfamiliar voices in the living room. Eleanor had invited neighbours over for drinks, neighbours I had been meaning to get to know since we moved in, but somehow never had the opportunity. Now they were sitting in my rearranged living room admiring Eleanor's tasteful updates to the cottage. "There she is," Eleanor trilled as I entered. "Our hard-working girl always at the office. Marceline, you know the Petersons from down the street, don't you?" I managed polite greetings, acutely aware of my rumpled work clothes and tired appearance next to Eleanor's perfectly put-together ensemble and freshly applied lipstick. "Eleanor was just telling us about the garden redesign," Mrs. Peterson said. "It sounds lovely." "Garden redesign," I repeated, a cold feeling spreading through my chest. "Just a few suggestions," Eleanor said smoothly. "Those raised beds you built are charming but not very practical. I've sketched out some improvements for spring planting." "I don't recall discussing any garden changes," I said, struggling to keep my voice even. "Oh, we mentioned it last week," Eleanor waved dismissively. "You were distracted with work things. But don't worry, Richard has already spoken with a local landscaper. Everything's arranged." The room seemed to tilt around me. My garden, my last remaining sanctuary, was now also under Eleanor's control. I mumbled an excuse about needing to change and fled upstairs, locking myself in the bathroom as tears threatened to overflow. When I emerged composed but hollow, the Petersons had left, and Thomas was home from his workshop. He greeted me with a distracted kiss. "How was work?" he asked, already moving toward the kitchen where Eleanor was preparing dinner. "Thomas, we need to talk," I said, gripping his arm to stop his forward momentum. "About the garden, about your mother making changes without consulting me." He sighed, the sound heavy with impatience. "Can we do this later? I'm starving and Mom made pot roast." "No, we can't do this later," I insisted, my voice rising. "This is important. This is about respect for my space, for my home." "Our home," he corrected. "And they're just trying to help Marcy. The garden gets overgrown every summer because you're too busy with work. Mom's ideas actually make a lot of sense." "That's not the point," I was nearly shouting now. "The point is that decisions about our home should be made by us, by you and me, not by your parents." Richard appeared in the hallway, his imposing presence filling the space. "Everything all right out here? We can hear you in the kitchen, Marceline." The use of my full name like a teacher addressing a misbehaving student sent a surge of anger through me. "No, Richard, everything is not all right," I said, turning to face him. "I'm trying to have a private conversation with my husband about boundaries that have been repeatedly crossed in my home." Richard's eyebrows rose. "Boundaries? We're family, not tenants. There shouldn't be boundaries between family members." "Dad's right," Thomas said, placing a placating hand on my shoulder. "We're all living together now. We need to be flexible." "Living together," I repeated, focusing on the word that had jumped out at me. "This was supposed to be a 2-week stay. It's been 3 months. And they still can't return to Chicago," Thomas explained as if to a child. "The contractor found black mold. The entire house needs remediation." "Convenient," I muttered. "What's that supposed to mean?" Thomas's face hardened. "It means I'm starting to wonder if there was ever a water leak at all." The words burst out before I could stop them. "Or if your parents just decided they preferred living here, having you all to themselves again, treating me like an inconvenient house guest in my own home." Silence fell heavy and accusing. Thomas stared at me as if seeing a stranger. Richard's face flushed red with indignation. From the kitchen doorway, Eleanor watched with an expression of wounded dignity that I was certain she had perfected over decades of getting her way. "I think," Richard said, finally his voice dangerously quiet, "that you owe us an apology, Marceline." "I don't think I do," I replied, a strange calm settling over me as months of suppressed feelings crystallized into resolve. "In fact, I think it's time for some truth. This arrangement isn't working for me. I need my home back. I need my husband back. I need to not feel like a stranger in the space I created." "If that's how you feel about family," Thomas said coldly, "then maybe you need to reconsider your priorities." The betrayal in those words, my husband siding definitively with his parents against me, struck like a physical blow. Without another word, I grabbed my car keys and left driving aimlessly until I found myself at a small hotel by the harbour. I checked in for the night, sat on the edge of the generic hotel bed, and finally allowed myself to break down completely. I cried for the home I had lost, for the partnership that had revealed itself to be conditional, for the woman I had been before the Oldens arrived. confident, creative, secure in my space and relationships. When the tears finally subsided, I lay back on the unfamiliar pillows and stared at the ceiling. Something had to change. I couldn't continue living as a ghost in my own life, watching as the Oldens erased every trace of me from the home I had dreamed of for so long. As dawn broke over the harbour, I made a decision. I would not be driven from my home. I would not surrender the life I had built. Instead, I would find a way to reclaim my space, my voice, and my marriage, or discover if there was anything left worth saving. I returned to the cottage the next morning, half expecting concerned messages from Thomas about my whereabouts. There were none. In fact, when I entered the kitchen, the three Oldens were having breakfast, as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't been gone all night. "There you are," Eleanor said, barely glancing up from her grapefruit. "We saved you some coffee." The casual dismissal of my absence, the absolute lack of concern solidified my resolve. As I poured coffee into a mug, not even my favourite mug which had mysteriously disappeared weeks ago, I began to formulate a plan. It would take careful preparation, strategic thinking, and courage I wasn't sure I possessed. But standing in my kitchen that morning, feeling like a stranger in my own home, I knew I had reached the breaking point. The time for patience, for accommodation, for silent suffering had passed. Now was the time for action. After the breakfast that no one seemed to notice I had missed, I retreated to the garden, now dormant under a light dusting of early winter snow. Sitting on the cold bench, I began to plan how to reclaim my life. First, I needed allies. I called my sister Amelia, who lived in California with her husband and twins. Though we spoke regularly, I had downplayed the situation with the Oldens, not wanting to sound petty or ungrateful for family support. Now I told her everything. "Jesus, Marcy, why didn't you say something sooner?" Her voice was a mix of concern and outrage. "This isn't normal. It's not okay." "I know that now," I admitted. But it happened so gradually. First it was just a guest room, then the kitchen, then my studio. Each change seemed small enough to tolerate, but now they've taken over your entire life, Amelia finished. And Thomas is letting them. Worse than letting them, he's enabling them, encouraging them even. "So what are you going to do?" she asked. "Because you can't keep living like this." "I'm working on a plan," I said, "but I might need your help." Amelia didn't hesitate. "Whatever you need. You want me to fly out there and throw their luggage on the lawn because I will." For the first time in months, I laughed. A genuine from-the-belly laugh that felt like breaking through ice. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm thinking of something a bit more strategic." We talked for another hour, refining my nascent plan into something concrete. By the time we hung up, I had the outline of an approach that addressed both the immediate problem, reclaiming my physical space, and the deeper issue of my marriage. Next, I contacted Natalie, who had a friend specializing in family therapy. "I need to understand the psychology behind what's happening," I explained, "and how to effectively address it." Dr. Harper agreed to meet with me the following day during my lunch break in Boston. Her office was warm and inviting, ironically, much like my cottage had been before the Oldens' arrival. "What you're describing, Jim," she said after I explained the situation, "is a classic power struggle over territory complicated by family dynamics and your husband's unresolved relationship with his parents. So I'm not crazy for feeling like I'm being systematically erased from my own home. Not at all," she assured me. "In fact, your in-laws' behavior shows a striking disregard for boundaries that suggests they've been doing this for years, perhaps even throughout Thomas's childhood." "How do I fix it?" I asked. "That depends on what outcome you're hoping for," Dr. Harper replied. "Are you looking to evict your in-laws, salvage your marriage, or both?" The question gave me pause. I had been so focused on reclaiming my physical space that I hadn't fully confronted the damage to my relationship with Thomas. "Both," I said finally. "If possible, but I need my home back regardless." Dr. Harper nodded. "Then you need an approach that addresses the territorial issues directly, while creating an opportunity for honest communication about the underlying relationship dynamics." We spent the rest of the session discussing specific strategies for asserting boundaries, techniques for productive confrontation, and ways to help Thomas recognize the unhealthy patterns he was perpetuating. Armed with new insights and a clearer plan, I made one more stop before returning to Maine, an architect's office. Mark Dawson had been a collaborator on several of my design projects, and I trusted his judgment. "I need conceptual drawings for an addition to my cottage," I explained. "Something that could serve as a separate living space for extended family." Mark raised an eyebrow. "In-law suite." "Something like that," I confirmed. but I need it quickly. Can you draft preliminary plans based on the cottage measurements I already have on file? For you, absolutely. Give me 2 days. My final step was the most difficult and honest conversation with myself about what I truly wanted and what I was willing to accept. Sitting in a cafe nursing a cup of tea, I made lists in my journal: what I need, my physical space back home studio garden, respect for my boundaries and preferences, a partner who prioritizes our relationship, clear expectations and timelines for the future, what I'm willing to compromise on, having extended family visits with boundaries, sharing some spaces and decision-making, working toward forgiveness for past hurt. What I cannot accept. Continued erasure of my presence in my home. A marriage where I'm second to my in-laws. Living indefinitely in the current situation, seeing my needs and boundaries written in black and white strengthened my resolve. This wasn't about being selfish or unwelcoming. This was about basic dignity and respect, things everyone deserved in their own home, in their own marriage. Over the next week, I gathered the necessary components for what I had begun to think of as my delivery. Mark provided detailed plans for a charming in-law suite that could be built above the detached garage, complete with a bedroom, small living area, kitchenette, and full bathroom. I consulted with a contractor for realistic pricing and timelines. I drafted a formal cohabitation agreement with the help of a lawyer friend, outlining clear expectations for shared spaces, decision-making processes, and yes, a move-out date. I also prepared myself emotionally for any outcome. While I hoped for reconciliation and a healthier family dynamic, I had to acknowledge the possibility that Thomas would choose his parents over our marriage. If that happened, I needed to be ready to stand my ground, to fight for the home I had saved years to create. The night before my planned delivery, I couldn't sleep. Doubts crept in like shadows. Was I overreacting? Was I being unfair to Eleanor and Richard, who were family after all? Was I risking my marriage over what Thomas might see as trivial domestic matters? Then I remembered how it felt to return home and find my grandmother's handmade quilt. The one she had stitched for my wedding, incorporating fabric from my mother's dress, had been accidentally damaged when Eleanor decided to rearrange the linen closet. I remembered how Thomas had minimized my distress, suggesting we just buy a new one. I remembered the slow disappearance of everything that made the cottage mine. The pottery collection now boxed in the attic, the botanical prints replaced with Eleanor's preferred landscapes, even my favorite coffee mug that had mysteriously broken during one of Eleanor's kitchen reorganizations. No, I wasn't overreacting. I was finally standing up for myself after months of being gradually erased from my own life. The next morning, I woke early and prepared a special breakfast. Belgian waffles with fresh berries, crispy bacon, and freshly squeezed orange juice. It was a peace offering of sorts, but also a statement. This is my kitchen, my home, my ability to nurture and provide. What's the occasion? Thomas asked clearly, surprised by the elaborate spread as he entered the kitchen. I'd like to have a family meeting after breakfast, I said calmly. There are some things we need to discuss. Eleanor, entering behind Thomas, raised an eyebrow. A family meeting? How formal? Yes. I confirmed, meeting her gaze directly. It is formal because what I have to say is important. Richard joined us already dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks, despite having nowhere to go. Something smells delicious, he boomed, seemingly oblivious to the tension. We ate breakfast with stilted conversation, the Oldens exchanging glances, as I maintained a pleasant but determined demeanor. When everyone had finished, I cleared the plates and asked them to gather in the living room. My heart pounded as I retrieved my carefully prepared materials from where I had hidden them in the garden shed, the one place Eleanor never ventured. Taking a deep breath, I returned to the living room where the three Oldens waited, with expressions ranging from curious Thomas to wary Eleanor to impatient Richard. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I began standing rather than sitting to maintain a position of authority. I've given a lot of thought to our living situation over the past few months, and I've prepared some options for moving forward. Options. Richard frowned. What do you mean, options? I mean that the current arrangement isn't working for me, I said firmly, and I believe we need a structured plan to address the issues that have arisen from our extended cohabitation. Eleanor's lips thinned. I thought we were getting along splendidly. We've done so much to improve this charming little place. The condescension in her tone strengthened my resolve. That's actually part of the problem, Eleanor. The changes you've made weren't improvements to me. They were erasures of my taste, my preferences, and ultimately my presence in my own home. Now, Marceline, Richard began, but I held up a hand. Please let me finish. I have some deliveries for you all to consider. I reached into my folder and removed the first document, the cohabitation agreement. This is a formal family cohabitation agreement that outlines expectations for shared spaces, decision-making processes, and mutual respect for personal boundaries. I handed copies to each of them, watching as they skimmed the document with increasing disbelief. "You expect us to sign a contract to live with family?" Eleanor asked, her voice rising with indignation. "I expect us to have clear, mutually agreed-upon boundaries," I corrected. "Whether that's formalized in writing or simply understood and respected is up to you." Before they could object further, I produced the architectural plans. "My second delivery is this. Plans for an in-law suite addition above the garage. It would provide you with your own private living space while still keeping you close to Thomas." Thomas looked up from the drawings, his expression unreadable. "You've been planning this behind our backs." "I've been problem-solving," I countered, "looking for a way that respects everyone's needs, including mine." "And what is this?" Richard demanded, pointing to the calendar I had just placed on the coffee table. "That's the third delivery, a timeline, either for your move back to Chicago or for beginning construction on the in-law suite. Either way, a decision needs to be made within 30 days. The room fell silent. Eleanor's face had gone pale, Richard's ruddy with anger. Thomas stared at me as if seeing a stranger. "There's one more delivery," I said, my voice softening slightly as I removed a sealed envelope from my folder. "This is a letter I've written expressing how the past few months have affected me, what I need going forward, and my hopes for our family's future. I'd appreciate if you'd all read it before responding to the other items." I handed the letter to Thomas, who took it automatically, his expression still stunned. "This is preposterous," Richard finally exploded. "We are family. Family doesn't need contracts and deadlines and separate living quarters. Family also doesn't erase a member's existence from their own home," I replied steadily. "Family respects boundaries and individual needs. Family communicates honestly instead of manipulating situations to get their way." "Is that what you think we've been doing?" Eleanor asked, her voice taking on the wounded tone I had come to recognize as a deflection tactic. "Manipulating you, after all we've done to help improve this place. I think," I said carefully, "that you've been recreating your Chicago home here with little regard for the fact that this is my home, a home I saved for 8 years to create a home I poured my heart and design expertise into, a home that reflected my taste and needs until you arrived." "Marcy," Thomas finally spoke, his voice strained. "This is extreme. You could have just talked to us." "I tried talking to you, Thomas, multiple times. You dismissed my concerns, told me I was overreacting, suggested I needed to be more flexible. When exactly did you listen to me?" His silence was damning. "I don't expect an answer today," I continued. "Take time to read the letter, review the options, discuss among yourselves. But know this, things cannot continue as they are. I won't allow it." "You won't allow it?" Richard's voice was dangerous. "This is my son's home too." "Yes," I agreed. "It is. And Thomas has a choice to make about what kind of home he wants. One where his wife is respected as an equal partner, or one where his parents dictate the terms of everyone's existence." I turned to Thomas, meeting his conflicted gaze directly. "I love you. I want our marriage to work, but not at the expense of my dignity and sense of self." With that, I gathered my empty folder and left the room, my heart pounding, but my steps steady. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. The woman who had worked and saved and dreamed of a home that was truly hers. Whatever happened next, I had taken back my power. I had delivered not just options for our living situation, but a clear message about my worth and my boundaries. Now it was up to the Oldens, all 3 of them, to decide how they would respond. The hours following my delivery were tense and quiet. The Oldens retreated to various corners of the cottage. Eleanor to the guest room, Richard to my former studio, and Thomas to his workshop in the garage. I occupied myself in the garden, clearing dead growth and preparing beds for spring planting, regardless of Eleanor's redesign plans. By dinner time, no one had approached me for discussion. I prepared a simple meal, set the table, and called everyone to eat. The atmosphere was strained, conversation limited to requests to pass dishes. I noticed Thomas watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise mixed with something else. Respect, perhaps. After dinner, as I washed dishes alone, Eleanor having claimed a sudden headache, Thomas joined me at the sink. "That was quite a presentation this morning," he said, picking up a dish towel. "It needed to be said," I replied, handing him a clean plate to dry. "Some of it, maybe." He dried the plate methodically. But contracts architectural plans. A timeline. Don't you think that's a bit formal for family? I set down the sponge and turned to face him. Tell me honestly, Thomas. If the situation were reversed, if my parents had moved in and gradually taken over, your workshop changed your tools, dismissed your expertise, would you consider it just family? He frowned, considering. That's different. Is it? Why? Because your work is important and mine isn't, because your space matters and mine doesn't. I didn't say that, he protested. You didn't have to, I said quietly. Your actions, or rather your inaction, said it for you. We finished the dishes in silence. As Thomas turned to leave, I asked, Did you read the letter? He nodded. I did. And I need time to think. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. This is complicated, Marcy. It shouldn't be, I replied. Not if you love me the way I love you. The days that followed were a strange limbo. The Oldens continued their usual routines, but with a new wariness, as if uncertain of their footing in the home they had so confidently claimed. I noticed small telling changes. Eleanor asking before using my baking supplies, Richard lowering the television volume without being asked, Thomas watching me with growing awareness as if truly seeing me for the first time in months. A week after my delivery, I returned from a Boston workday to find Thomas waiting for me on the porch. The sight was so reminiscent of our early days in the cottage that my heart clenched with both hope and caution. Can we talk? He asked, gesturing to the porch swing we had once spent evenings on together before the Oldens' arrival had shifted our routines. I nodded, joining him on the swing. The December air was crisp, our breath visible in small clouds. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Thomas began, about boundaries and respect and partnership. Cousin. I waited, allowing him the space to continue without interruption. I talked to Dad yesterday, he continued. Really talked for the first time in years. He admitted something interesting, that he and Mum have always struggled with boundaries, that their marriage counsellor in the 90s actually cited it as their primary issue. This was news. Your parents went to marriage counselling, Thomas nodded. Apparently they nearly divorced when I was in high school. Mum's need to control everything, Dad's workaholic tendencies. It almost broke them. The counsellor helped them establish better patterns, but I guess old habits resurface under stress. Like being displaced from their home, I acknowledged. Exactly. Thomas shifted to face me more directly. I'm not excusing their behaviour, or mine, but I think I understand it better now. Dad said they felt adrift after the water damage, vulnerable. Coming here was meant to be temporary, but they found comfort in exerting control over their environment, our environment. At my expense, I pointed out. Yes. Thomas agreed, surprising me with his directness. At your expense. And I let it happen because it was easier than confronting the reality that my parents are flawed, that they can be selfish and controlling, that the dynamic I grew up with isn't necessarily healthy. His admission hung in the cold air between us, more honest than anything he had said in months. I'm sorry, Marcy, he continued, reaching for my hand. I've been a terrible partner. I chose the path of least resistance instead of standing by you. I prioritized my parents' comfort over your well-being. I made you feel like a guest in your own home. The apology was everything I had wanted to hear, but I remained cautious. What changed? Why now? Your letter, he said simply. The way you described feeling invisible, erased from your own life. It broke my heart. And then watching you this past week, how you've reclaimed your presence without spite or meanness, just quiet determination. I realized how much I admire your strength, how much I've missed the woman I married. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them back. What about your parents? The living situation? Thomas squeezed my hand. I spoke with them this morning. Really spoke. Not just avoided conflict or went along with what they wanted. I told them things need to change, that we need to respect your boundaries, that this is your home as much as mine. And their reaction? Mixed, he admitted. Dad was defensive at first. Mum cried, which is her go-to when confronted. But I didn't back down. I showed them the in-law suite plans again, explained how it could be a perfect solution, giving them independence while keeping them close. Are they considering it? I asked, hardly daring to hope. They're doing more than considering it, Thomas replied, a small smile forming. They're talking with the contractor tomorrow. Dad actually seemed excited about customizing the space. Relief washed over me, so powerful I felt momentarily lightheaded. So they're staying permanently. If that's okay with you, Thomas said carefully. The in-law suite would be their space, the cottage ours. Clear boundaries separate living areas, but family still close. I considered this outcome, not the eviction I had initially imagined, but perhaps something better. A compromise that respected everyone's needs while maintaining family connections. I think I could be okay with that, I said slowly. As long as the boundaries are clear and respected. As long as I have my home back. You will, Thomas promised. Starting now, Mum's already boxing up her things from the kitchen. Dad's clearing out your studio, and I've taken the week off to help restore each room to the way you had it. The gesture was significant. Thomas prioritizing our home over his work, actively participating in making things right. There's one more thing, he added, reaching into his jacket pocket. I found this in a box in the attic. I think Mum put it there during one of her reorganizing sessions. He handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was my missing coffee mug, the handmade ceramic one with painted forget-me-nots that had been a gift from my first design client. It wasn't broken after all, I whispered, running my finger along the familiar rim. No, Thomas agreed. And neither are we. Bent maybe, strained, but not broken. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against mine, in the intimate gesture we had shared countless times before the Oldens' arrival had created distance between us. I choose you, Marceline, he said softly. I choose our partnership, our home, the life we built together. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember what matters most. The sincerity in his voice, the earnestness in his eyes melted the last of my reserve. I leaned into his embrace, allowing myself to believe that healing was possible, that our home and marriage could be restored. The transition wasn't instantaneous or without challenges. There were awkward moments as Eleanor struggled to relinquish control of spaces she had claimed. There were tense conversations as boundaries were established and expectations clarified. There was the practical matter of construction, the noise, the decisions, the inevitable delays. But gradually, room by room, my cottage re-emerged from beneath the layers of Eleanor's influence. My pottery returned to the kitchen shelves. My grandmother's quilt, carefully mended by Richard, in a gesture of unexpected reconciliation, reclaimed its place on our bed. My studio, once again filled with light and design materials, became my sanctuary for creativity. Thomas proved true to his word, actively participating in the restoration of our home and the establishment of new family dynamics. He intervened when Eleanor slipped into old habits, gently but firmly reminding her of our agreements. He created special time for just the two of us. Date nights, weekend excursions, quiet evenings on the porch swing where we reconnected as partners. The construction of the in-law suite progressed steadily through the winter and into spring. By early April, the space above the garage had transformed into a charming apartment with large windows overlooking the garden, a small but efficient kitchenette, and custom built-ins designed by Thomas himself. Eleanor, to my surprise, consulted me on colour schemes and furnishings, genuinely listening to my suggestions while still expressing her own preferences for their personal space. The day the in-laws moved into their new quarters marked a symbolic fresh start for all of us. Thomas and I helped carry their belongings across the yard, the four of us sharing a bottle of champagne on their new private deck once everything was settled. A toast, Richard proposed, raising his glass. To new beginnings and better boundaries. To family, Eleanor added, meeting my eyes with newfound respect. And to the remarkable woman who taught us that true family respects each member's needs. To home, I said simply, looking around at the cottage restored to its true character, the garden beginning to bloom with spring's promise and the new structure that represented both separation and connection. As the seasons changed, so did our family dynamic. The in-laws maintained their independence in their suite while joining us for regular meals and activities. Eleanor still offered decorating suggestions, but now as possibilities rather than directives. Richard found purpose in community activities, joining the town's historical society and reducing his hovering presence in our daily lives. Thomas and I renewed our connection through honest communication and shared projects. We planted a larger vegetable garden that summer, with a section specifically designated for Eleanor's preferred formal plantings, a compromise that symbolized our new approach to family life. The most unexpected development came on a warm June evening as we all enjoyed dinner on the porch. Eleanor, uncharacteristically hesitant, mentioned that their Chicago house renovations were finally complete. The contractor sent pictures yesterday, she said, passing her phone around the table. Everything's ready for occupancy. A tense silence fell, memories of the original temporary visit hanging in the air. We've been discussing options, Richard continued, glancing at Eleanor for confirmation. We could sell the Chicago house, make this arrangement permanent. Or we could split our time. Summers here, winters in Chicago. I looked at Thomas, who squeezed my hand under the table, communicating his support for whatever I decided. I think, I said carefully, that having options is exactly what family is about. You're welcome here, in your space with our boundaries intact, for as much or as little time as works for all of us. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Genuine emotion, not the manipulative displays I had come to recognize. You're teaching an old dog new tricks, Marceline. I never thought I'd learn to share my son at this stage of life. You're not sharing him, I corrected gently. You're expanding your family to truly include me. There's a difference. Later that night, as Thomas and I lay in bed in our reclaimed sanctuary, he traced patterns on my arm in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. When you planned that delivery, he murmured, did you ever imagine this outcome? That they would literally stay forever, at least part-time. I considered the question thinking back to those dark days when I had felt erased from my own life. No, I admitted. I thought the options were either they leave or I leave. I never imagined we could find a way to all stay just differently. Your delivery changed everything, Thomas said. Not just the living arrangements, but us. All of us. Mum's actually talking about boundaries with her friends like she invented the concept. I laughed softly, nestling closer to him. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family is set clear limits. It took me a long time to understand that. I'm glad you didn't give up on us, Thomas whispered. That you fought for your home, for yourself, for what our marriage could be. As I drifted towards sleep in the cottage that was once again truly mine, yet now expanded to include others on new, healthier terms, I reflected on the journey of the past year. From dream home to nightmare, from invisibility to empowerment, from broken boundaries to newfound strength. My in-laws had indeed taken over my dream home, and through an unexpected delivery of courage, clarity, and compassion, I had created a situation where they could stay forever, not as invaders, but as family. Not on their terms, but on terms we had all chosen together. Sometimes I realized the happy ending isn't getting exactly what you thought you wanted. Sometimes it's discovering that what you really needed was the courage to stand up for yourself, the wisdom to offer grace alongside boundaries, and the faith that broken relationships can be rebuilt, stronger, healthier, and more authentic than before. It's been 2 years since that pivotal delivery that changed everything in our family dynamic. As I sit on the porch swing, watching Thomas and Richard build a playhouse in the garden for our 6-month-old daughter Lily, I can hardly believe how far we've come. The in-law suite has become exactly what we all needed. A space that provides independence while maintaining connection. Eleanor and Richard spend roughly half the year with us, now typically summers and holiday seasons, and the rest of their time in Chicago. When they're here, we have family dinners 3 times a week, a schedule that gives everyone the right balance of togetherness and privacy. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation has been in Eleanor. The woman who once rearranged my kitchen without asking now knocks before entering our part of the property. She still offers decorating suggestions, but as possibilities rather than directives. I saw the most lovely curtain fabric that would complement your living room color scheme. Would you like me to show you? Richard has found purpose in community involvement, serving on the Historical Preservation Committee and mentoring young entrepreneurs at the local community college. His booming voice and commanding presence, once so intrusive in our small cottage, are now directed outward in ways that benefit others, while giving our home the quiet it needs. Thomas has grown tremendously as well. The man who once automatically sided with his parents over me has become a thoughtful mediator and boundary enforcer. When Eleanor occasionally slips into old habits, commenting on my parenting choices or suggesting improvements to our routines, Thomas gently but firmly redirects her. Mum, remember our agreement. Marceline and I make the decisions for our household. Our marriage has deepened through the challenges we weathered. The honest conversations sparked by my delivery opened channels of communication that had been blocked by conflict avoidance and people-pleasing. We attend couples therapy monthly, not because we're in crisis, but because we value the skills and insights it provides. The cottage itself has evolved to accommodate our growing family. We converted the smallest bedroom into a nursery, for Lily painting the walls a soft sage green and filling the space with a mix of heirloom pieces, a rocking chair from my grandmother and handcrafted items, a crib Thomas built himself. My design studio remains sacrosanct, a professional and creative space that everyone respects as mine alone. Perhaps most surprising has been the evolution of my relationship with Eleanor. After Lily's birth, I experienced unexpected postpartum anxiety. It was Eleanor who noticed my struggles first, who quietly stepped in to hold the baby while I napped, who prepared nourishing meals without taking over my kitchen. When I tearfully admitted feeling overwhelmed one afternoon, she shared her own experience with postpartum difficulties after Thomas's birth, something she had never spoken about before. "I felt so alone," she confided. "In those days, you didn't talk about struggling as a new mother. You just pushed through and pretended everything was perfect." That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship, a recognition of shared vulnerability that softened the edges of our differences. We'll never be best friends, Eleanor and I, but we've found a mutual respect that makes our family stronger. Richard, too, has shown unexpected depths. He takes evident joy in being a grandfather, his formerly intimidating presence gentling around Lily. He's teaching Thomas traditional woodworking techniques passed down from his own father, creating a lineage of craftsmanship that will eventually include Lily if she's interested. As for me, I've grown in ways I never anticipated. The woman who planned that delivery 2 years ago was fighting for survival, for recognition, for the most basic respect in her own home. I needed to draw hard lines then to make dramatic statements to be heard. Now I've learnt the art of flexible boundaries, knowing when to stand firm and when to bend, how to respect others' needs while honouring my own. I've returned to design work part-time, taking on select projects that ignite my creativity while allowing plenty of time for family. My professional confidence, so undermined during those months of erasure, has returned stronger than before. Last month, one of my renovation projects was featured in a national design magazine, a validation that brought tears to my eyes when I saw the spread. Our garden has become a physical manifestation of our new family balance. Sections reflecting different styles and preferences coming together in a harmonious whole. Eleanor's formal rose garden transitions into my cottage plantings, which flow into the vegetable beds Thomas and I maintain together. Even Richard has his corner growing heirloom tomatoes with surprising tenderness for a man once so removed from domestic matters. Life isn't perfect, of course. We still have disagreements, moments of tension, when old patterns threaten to resurface. Eleanor occasionally makes a pointed comment about my unusual parenting choices. Richard sometimes forgets that his opinions aren't commands. Thomas and I have arguments about household responsibilities and future plans like any couple. But the difference now is that we have tools to address these moments. Established boundaries, clear communication channels, mutual respect that allows for honest expression of feelings without fear of retaliation or rejection. As I watch my daughter reach up from her blanket toward a butterfly, her delighted giggle carrying across the garden, I'm struck by how differently she'll experience family than either Thomas or I did growing up. She'll learn that boundaries aren't walls, but necessary definitions that allow relationships to flourish. She'll see that disagreement doesn't have to mean disconnection. She'll witness adults modeling respect, compromise, and authentic communication. The delivery I planned in desperation 2 years ago wasn't just about reclaiming physical space. It was about delivering myself, and ultimately our entire family, from patterns that diminished rather than nurtured. It was about creating something new from what was broken. Eleanor calls from the in-law suite deck, waving a pitcher of lemonade. Refreshments for the hard-working builders. Marceline, shall we take a break? I gather Lily in my arms and join my mother-in-law on the deck that bridges our separate living spaces, a physical representation of the connected independence we've cultivated. As Thomas and Richard climb the stairs laughing about some shared joke, I feel a profound sense of gratitude. My in-laws did take over my dream home, temporarily erasing me from spaces I had lovingly created. The delivery I planned in response could have ended in permanent estrangement. Instead, it became the foundation for something I never could have imagined, a multi-generational family that respects individual needs while nurturing meaningful connection. They stayed forever, yes, but not as invaders, as family in the truest sense of the word. Have you ever had to establish boundaries with family members living in your home? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. This journey taught me that standing up for yourself doesn't mean pushing others away. Sometimes it actually creates the foundation for deeper, healthier relationships. If my story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more real-life experiences. And if you know someone struggling with family boundaries, share this video with them. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in these challenges makes all the difference. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your home should be a place where you feel seen, respected, and truly at home.